First, Vladimir Putin. Now, President Trump meeting one-on-one with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The president's expected to press China to do more to get North Korea to roll back its nuclear program following its launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Well, now the U.S. responding with its own show of force, flying B-1 bombers very near the border with North Korea. Welcome, everybody. I'm David Asman. This is a special edition of Cost of Freedom. We're going to be monitoring that meeting overseas, and if the White House makes any comments, we will bring them to you immediately. To John Roberts now. He's in Hamburg, Germany, where all this is going down. Been following it for several days now. John.
And David, good morning to you. Just a couple of minutes ago, President Trump sat down with Xi Jinping of China for what will be the last bilateral of this G20. We're told we're hoping that we're going to have live video of that. That didn't happen, but I'm told that it was very brief. They didn't take any questions. In the background, you'll hear a press conference going on with Angela Merkel, who's the host of this G20. We had thought that we might get a press conference with President Trump. One had been on the board for a while, but we're told that because of scheduling, that is not going to happen. So the last we will hear from the president, David, is when that pool tape, as it's called, of him sitting down with Xi Jinping is played out. You mentioned what's on the agenda will be trade. President Trump, to a greater degree, trying to level the playing field in trade between the U.S. and China. The president not happy about the fact that there's a $347 billion trade deficit. But the more pressing, the more important issue right now is what China can do to help the United States get North Korea to rein in its nuclear program. The president's rhetoric toward China on that front has been getting more aggressive lately. You saw a tweet earlier this week where he pointed out that trade between China and North Korea increased 40% in the first quarter of this year. He basically said so much for China helping us with North Korea. So he's really going to point out today to Xi Jinping that they've got to get together and they've got to do something about North Korea's nuclear program, made all the more urgent by that missile test earlier in the week of that intercontinental ballistic missile that is really starting to raise the concerns that North Korea is close to being capable of putting a nuclear weapon on a missile that can reach the United States. And that's something that the president is not going to let happen. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, yesterday called it this positive pressure campaign, putting some pressure on North Korea, hopefully to get it to react, saying if this doesn't work, there are very few good options left. Yesterday, it was all about the bilateral meeting with President Vladimir Putin of Russia, the very first time the two leaders have sat down together. And there's a little bit of a diplomatic spat coming out of that about who said what to whom and whose account of what transpired is accurate. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, saying when President Putin assured President Trump that he had nothing to do with meddling in the U.S. election, President Trump, quote, accepted those assurances. Told by White House officials that that's not true. The president did not accept his assurances. In fact, he went back at President Putin a couple of times, but eventually came to the point where they determined that we can either have an argument for the rest of this bilateral meeting, or we can just say, okay, that's your position, this is my position, now let's move on to other issues. But to hear the Secretary of State tell it yesterday, the president was quite forceful in his admonition of President Putin as to what was going on with the election. Listen here.
The president opened the meeting with President Putin by raising the concerns of the American people regarding Russian interference in the 2016 election. They had a very robust and lengthy exchange on the subject. The president pressed President Putin on more than one occasion regarding Russian involvement. President Putin denied such involvement, as I think he has in the past. I think the president at this point, he pressed him and then, felt like at this point, let's talk about how do we go forward. And I think that was the right place to spend our time, rather than spending a lot of time having a disagreement, that everybody knows we have a disagreement.
So everybody knows we have a disagreement, and we didn't want to belabor that particular point, so we moved on to other things. And one of the constructive things they did get done, David, was an agreement for a ceasefire in Syria, which will take effect tomorrow, trying to keep the two sides apart while the United States, Russia, and others battle ISIS in hopes that there will eventually be a political solution in Syria. So again, we expect to get tape in very soon at that bilateral meeting with the president and President Xi, and that is the last that we will hear of President Trump here at the G20. A shame. It would have been great to hear more from him, but that's what they've decided. David?
John Roberts, terrific reporting for this whole week. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. To Kirk Lippold now. He is a former commander in the U.S. Navy, and he was the former commander of the USS Cole. Commander, let's first talk about what the president has done here, because it is extraordinary that his 2 trips abroad, all the media, the mainstream media, was worried about, whether he's going to be the Trump from his tweets or a man of state. And he certainly has done this country well, not only in what he has done, how he's comported himself over there, but what he is bringing home: jobs, various trade deals, etc.
I think you're absolutely right, David. When you look at what the president achieved during this conference, he clearly set out the mark. And it wasn't just a nationalistic America First approach. It was, we as Americans have to have fair trade and fair agreement going into this G20 conference. He laid out what our agenda and criteria were going to be. He looked at the fact that we had withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, the impact of that, and how we were going to move forward as a nation to ensure that American interests are taken into a broader consideration during these large multilateral organizational meetings.
Now, we'll talk about Russia in a second, but right now he's meeting with the Chinese. North Korea is foremost on the agenda. Of course, the North Koreans promised that they would cut back in trade. They did cut back in coal trade with North Korea, but they've increased their overall trade, as the president pointed out in a tweet, by 40%. How do we twist their arms a little to get them to stop that?
I think we're past the point, David, where incremental measures are going to work. At this point, we set aside North Korea. I think the State Department, as the lead organization in this is not a military or DOD issue. I think State Department at this point must develop a comprehensive breadth and depth of sanctions that we need to go to the Chinese and say, here is the impact if you continue to support and allow North Korea to build nuclear weapons, miniaturize them, build an ICBM capable of hitting the west coast of the United States and eventually the entire U.S., so that they understand we mean serious and we mean business. The Chinese are the only ones that have leverage when 80% of the North Korean economy depends on them, that can apply the pressure necessary. It doesn't need to be done vocally. It doesn't need to be done with a bunch of media and everybody else. But very quietly, that pressure needs to be applied, and now. Incremental measures no longer work.
And very quickly, Commander, Russia, we may be hearing, by the way, from President Putin any moment right now. We're not going to hear from President Trump soon, but we may be hearing from him. He and the president apparently did agree on a ceasefire, at least for part of the country of Syria, but our differences still far outweigh those things in which we share an interest, correct?
Absolutely. But the process right here is working. The fact that we are talking to the Russians, that we are working with them in that region of the world, that we recognize that they're going to have a role in the future of Syria, that we need to look at priority. How do we defeat ISIS, get that eliminated? Can there be and will there be a political solution to what is going on in Syria, taking into account other players in the region, whether that's Saudi Arabia or Turkey? But nonetheless, the fact that we and the Russians are speaking is clearly progress in that arena.
Commander Kirk Lippold, great to see you, Commander. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
President Trump promising to sell U.S. oil and gas to Europeans to help loosen Russia's grip on their energy supply. Here's what he said in Poland. Take a listen.
We are committed to securing your access to alternate sources of energy, so Poland and its neighbors are never again held hostage to a single supplier of energy.
To former Shell Oil President John Hofmeister, who joins me now. John, great to see you. This is a win-win, I think, for the United States. One, it's great for energy producers. It gives, particularly at a time when oil's coming down in price, and some frackers thought they might have to close up shop for a while until the prices went back up. This gives them a whole new market to deal with. And it's a win for Europeans, which, because of the fact the Russians had for years, for decades, held this sort of threat of cutting off oil if they did anything the Russians didn't like.
David, it all comes down to price. What will the price of the natural gas or other sources of energy, what will the price be? Because there is a lot of price back and forth that could take place. And if we're going to be using LNG as for example, as one of the fuels.
That's liquefied natural gas. Go ahead.
A whole lot of infrastructure will have to be built, and that infrastructure is going to take quite some time to build, and it's going to need investors to fund it in the hundreds of billions of dollars if you're talking about serious competition to Russia. So it's not like flipping a switch and suddenly we're using American supplies instead of Russian supplies.
But you know, John,
throughout Europe.
If I could just interject for a second here, I think of Ronald Reagan's plans in the early stages of his administration when he mapped out a plan for the end of the Soviet Union. We didn't actually achieve that end for about 10 years. It was during the next administration of the first George Bush as president. But you have to start somewhere, and this looks like a good beginning, no?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we are prime, probably among all suppliers around the world. We could go the fastest. We could be the most thorough. We could be just a daunting force competing with Russia. But we'd have to commit ourselves to it and stick with it. And that's where the investors come in. They've got to hang in there, knowing that it's a long-term play. But You're right. We have to begin somewhere.
And I want to move you to politics a little bit. I know you're fluent in that language as well. This is a big chip for the United States in our negotiations with Russia right now, particularly a man like Putin. He understands that this is a real threat to their market share in Europe. He understands we could follow through with this, and it gives us some leverage in negotiations over a whole range of things, does it not?
Absolutely. It's not just limited to oil and gas, because the Russian economy is almost entirely dependent upon selling its natural resources, particularly energy resources. And if they lose market share, they're in deeper trouble than they would ever admit, because it is really the cash flow that keeps that economy going, which is why during this period of low oil price, they have been really hit hard, even though they're not admitting it to the world outside.
And by the way, we have created, just in the 6 months that President Trump has been in office, an extra 5,000 fossil fuel energy jobs. So he is bringing the jobs, is he not?
Well, clearly, we're on a bit of a comeback, but still, the prices are not yet where they need to be, David, to bring the stability back to the business where investors, again, could count on sustained growth.
Of course, it's good for those of us who just fill up our tank every week, but we'll leave that aside because I know you're an oil guy. John Hofmeister, great to see you, my friend. Thank you very much for being here. Well, anti-capitalist protesters in Hamburg, Germany, trying to push leaders very far to the left. But look what's going on in Venezuela. How's that working out? Anti-capitalist protesters at the G20 summit in Hamburg are trying to push world leaders very far to the left. But look at socialist Venezuela. Is that what we want for the Western world? Emily Jashinsky and Wendy Osifo join us now. Well, Emily, maybe Angela Merkel, a lot of people were wondering, why would she have this in Hamburg? Because Hamburg is where a lot of these radical organizations in Europe are based. We knew there were going to be protests. Maybe she did the world a favor by showing us the face of some of the radical left in Europe.
Yeah, I actually think that's a good point. I think there's some value in exposing, especially the American public, to the far left protest culture that Europe has, very differently than even what we have here. And when you look at certainly what's happening in Europe right now, high unemployment, slow economic growth, the last thing they should want is the solutions that these far left protesters would have, which is expanded government.
Yeah.
Really, that's what they should be protesting against.
Emily, it's very interesting that President Trump is not so well received in Western Europe, but in Eastern Europe, they were chanting, "Go Trump." The countries that really had real-life experience with a socialist system, they seem to understand the Trump message better than Western Europe does.
Yeah, that's true. And if you look over sort of Eastern Europe, who do they have statues to? Ronald Reagan.
That was actually for Wendy. Go ahead, Wendy.
Well, actually, protesting is part of the thread and which makes up the fabric of any democracy. But when it does get unhinged, we have to start to question the method. However, we do see that there has been violence and uprisings from the right wing as well, whether that was on May 19th of this year, where right-wing agitators stormed the German ministry, or whether in March of 2016, where right-wing agitators again decided to throw firebombs and explosives at police officers. So
yeah, but Wendy, you look at the size of the crowds, I mean, there's no real comparison. Again, to my question, it's interesting that the countries that literally had to deal with socialism for decades, they seem to be very friendly to Trump. It's the Western Europeans who haven't actually had to live under real socialism where you find the hatred of Trump.
I don't think it's necessarily a hatred or a love for Trump. I think that each region, whether it's the western side of Europe or the eastern side of Europe, has their own grievances. And at the end of the day, no one is necessarily saying that what Trump is doing is something in which that they love. I think that there's more so this fanfare for Trump that we have seen.
Emily,
I don't think it drills down to the policies.
What I'm concerned with, and what this segment is about, is the fanfare for socialism, which seems to be what a lot of these protesters favor. When you look at all the examples in Europe, I mean, side by side with Western Europe, their Eastern European neighbors had to deal with socialism. And I don't think it's coincidental that Trump received a much better reception there.
No, I agree, and especially when you look at what it's done to their economy. And obviously, when you look at what Venezuela is right now, the protests, the violent protests, the tragic protests, there is really no better case study or really cautionary tale of the dangers of socialism and of the dangers of government control over the markets. And so I think they would do themselves a favor to look there and to learn from that example and to stop trying to bring that to their own countries and cause suffering among their own people.
Wendy, you know, we've seen these protesters so often, just about every time there was a big international meeting, whether it's in Europe or over here, et cetera. And I'm always wondering, don't these people have jobs? I mean, they've got a lot of time on their hands, no?
A good question. But for some people, they don't have jobs. And I think that that's part of the problem. So you actually speak directly to that.
But how can you do that if you don't have, I mean, these people are very able-bodied. Most of them are very able-bodied people that could presumably get a job if they wanted to, right?
And I think that's where the frustration is that they are able-bodied people, but their government is not creating opportunities for them to be able to get jobs. And I think that you just hit right on the point of what their frustration really lies upon.
Yeah, well, Emily, I think the government over in Europe gives them plenty of opportunities to take various forms of welfare, which gives them the time to go to demonstrations like this.
You know, I was going to say that's sort of the one thing, the notion that the government isn't giving them their opportunities. Well, the government should get out of the way and the opportunities will come. We know that's how that happens. We know jobs are not created by government and jobs are created by free markets. So that's really the key point.
Emily and Wendy, great to see you on this Saturday morning. Thank you for being here.
Well,
the Russian President Putin is holding a news conference. He just said that he thinks President Trump believes his denial of Russian meddling in U.S. vote, but better to ask Trump himself. Of course, Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, has said that they went back and forth a couple of times and then figured out there were other things on which they could agree that they should spend time talking. Meanwhile, Congress is returning to work this week. Tax cuts, health care, the major issues. Meet one Republican congressman saying, cancel the August recess and get these things done now. Well, the clock is ticking and Congress has a lot on its plate. Lawmakers still planning their August recess. Fox Business Network's Tracy Carrasco on what needs to get done. A lot is the short answer, right?
Absolutely a lot. And come this Monday, Congress will report back to work after a 10-day 4th of July holiday. You can see they'll be in Washington for just 15 days until July 28th. And then members of both the House and Senate will leave for their August recess, taking the whole month off until Labor Day, despite having a long legislative to-do list, which includes repealing and replacing Obamacare, tax reform, reining in federal spending, and passing a budget before the end of the fiscal year when the federal government technically runs out of money. Last week, before Congress adjourned for the 4th of July holiday, several GOP House members asked Speaker Paul Ryan to cancel the August recess to tackle this list. A letter to Ryan said, quote, during the 2016 elections, President Trump and Republican candidates running for the House and Senate promised the American people that with unified Republican government, we could achieve many of the policy priorities that have been mere wishes for the last several years. A group of Republican senators sent a similar letter to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, urging him to cancel the recess as well. Meanwhile, Kellyanne Conway has made it clear President Trump wants results.
Well, you know, the president will be working throughout August, no matter where he is. And so put him down for wanting people to work hard at all times. I mean, he outworks all of us as hard as we try.
Last summer, House Democrats called on their Republican colleagues to cancel their August recess to address a series of public health issues, Zika, the opioid epidemic, and gun violence. While it may be unlikely for the August recess to be canceled or shortened this year, so far there's been no one on either side of the aisle speaking out in favor of taking this summer vacation. David?
That would be a little too much, I think.
Yeah.
All right, my next guest is one of those congressmen pushing for Congress to work through the August recess. Republican Andy Biggs from Arizona joins me now. So is this thing getting any traction, Congressman?
Well, surprisingly, I think it is. It's undercurrent. We're little pebbles rolling down the hill trying to create an avalanche, but I think we're picking up steam, yeah.
How many? I guess you just need a majority of congressmen in order to have a quorum, right? So you could have all the Democrats not show up and all the Republicans show up, and you'd have a quorum. You could get stuff done.
Well, yeah, absolutely you could. I'm not sure that it would work out just like that, but the reality is we want to get something done. I think there's a lot of us that came in on that promise. A lot of old timers here who consider it vital that we should stay in as well. So I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can, stay in.
It is funny, though. It's one of those, as Tracy was just saying, it's one of those things where nobody will say, we have to have a recess. Nobody wants to admit that they have to have a vacation. But they're kind of hemming and hawing about going along with the canceling of the August recess. In the end, practically speaking, it's still a long shot, right?
Well, I think it's a long shot, but I mean, the optics are so bad to take 4 or 5 weeks off when we know that we have, a budget deadline looming. You have a debt ceiling debate that has to take place. Plus, we have the big timber to cut still of the health care repeal and the tax reform package. These are things that we have to get done, so.
And there is one thing that Congress people would like to avoid. That is going to these town hall meetings, some of which have become kind of riotous. When the people, I remember the Tea Parties back in the day after the 2010 elections, they got traction. Now the left wing is putting its people in the audiences, and it's kind of hard to get business done at these town halls.
Well, that can be pretty tough, but I mean, the reality is I head back as virtually every weekend, and I meet with constituents, business groups, voters, and of all kinds, talk to people. And you know what? It all comes back to the same thing. They want something done,
right? And
it's hard to get something done when we're not in session.
Well, it's also hard to get stuff done when you are in session. I'm thinking of health care, and it's just God Almighty, just the Republicans themselves. You got your left side and your right side. The left wants to keep Medicaid spending where it is. The right side wants to cut a lot of it off. I mean, I'm just wondering what concerns me the most, because I'm worried about the growth in the economy, is that tax cuts could get crowded out by all this focus on health care. What do you think?
Well, I think that one thing that everybody's unified on is the tax reform package. I mean, there's a few, in my opinion, that's just like a soundboard faders. You just need to move those to get to equality there. And I think we're pretty close on that, and we're working on that. And that's why, if you've got the momentum, why would you unplug for a month and not stay plugged in and get this stuff done?
Well, that's great news about taxes. Let's leave it on that hopeful note about taxes. Andy Biggs, good to see you. Have a wonderful vacation. If you take one, if you don't, we hope you get some work done. Andy Biggs, thank you. Well, President Trump meeting with China's President Xi right now at the G20 summit. Can we get China to do more to stop North Korea's nuclear growth? Right now, as we speak, President Trump and China's President Xi meeting and discussing North Korea, the rogue nation launching an ICBM missile this week. To Gordon Chang, he's author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. Gordon, you've been warning about this for a while. The president came out with a very frank tweet saying, look, we had to try to pull China back in its trade from North Korea, but it hasn't worked. They've increased their trade 40% with North Korea in the past 6 months. I know they have pulled back on coal trade, but what have they been increasing trade on?
Well, there's all sorts of violations of Security Council sanctions. So, for instance, they've been selling zinc, copper, silver in violation of 2 Security Council resolutions. Yeah, they say they pulled back on trade on February 18th, that they wouldn't buy any more coal from North Korea, but they bought coal from North Korea in February after the announcement, in April, May, and June. And you know, that's just not the least of it. Those numbers that come out of China's Commerce Ministry underplay the amount of commerce between China and North Korea.
So they're violating UN edicts by doing that, but they're also violating commitments. Maybe they were soft commitments, but commitments that they made with President Trump when they last met with him on his trip, when they came here, on his trip there. So what does he do?
Well, I think the first thing President Trump has to do is to ask the Chinese in public, how come North Korea has Chinese and Chinese-looking missiles and equipment in their arsenal?
You know, that's a very good question. Let me just, I don't know if we have any video of that, but what we found out this week was not only do they have missiles that look like they're from China, but they have these missile launchers, these mobile missile launchers. Clearly, they're not making these missile launchers in North Korea. They're getting them from somewhere. Where do they come from?
They're getting them from China. The missile that was fired on July 4th, the first ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, that's carried on a Chinese transporter erector launcher. Now, that's not the most sophisticated missile North Korea has. The most sophisticated missile they test on August 24th, February 12th, May 21st. Those missiles look like they are variants of China's JL-1 submarine-launched missile. Also, on April 15th, the North Koreans showed this big canister on top of a Chinese launcher. They paraded it through Kim Il-sung Square in Pyongyang. That looks like China's canister for its DF-41 missile. We don't know what's going on here, but we need the president to start asking these questions.
Well, I kind of stopped you in your tracks when I was asking how they turn the screws on China now, how the president does that. We just had something happening today, which is the B-1 bombers flew very close to the North Korean there's some pictures of the B-1 bombers that flew very close to the North Korean border. But this is a show of force. What specifically can be done to really hurt the Chinese and make them do something about North Korea, something substantive?
Well, you know, last week we unplugged Bank of Dandong from the global financial system for money laundering. That's a small fry Chinese institution. What they can go after is Bank of China, one of China's big four banks, because it's also been money laundering for the North Koreans. That was in a UN report of last year, and there's other instances I think that Bank of China has been violating.
How would China respond to that?
They would be really upset, of course, because, you know, we're taking one of their biggest banks and basically putting it out of business.
Would they stop buying our bonds, which a lot of people say they need to do?
Yeah, they've been selling our treasury since the middle of 2014 in order to support the renminbi. So we don't have to worry about that.
Gordon, final question. China is probably, their heads are spinning now trying to figure out how Donald Trump operates. I mean, it was that incredible dinner that the president had for Xi down in Florida, at which, when he was serving him chocolate cake, he announced that he was bombing Syria or the Syrian army. They must be wondering what the hell they have in the White House right now. They've never seen the likes of Donald. I mean, we haven't seen the likes of him either. But it really must be discombobulating for the Chinese.
Yeah, I think that they thought they had him figured out until that missile attack at the Mar-a-Lago. You know, because Syria is China's good friend. Also, Trump last week pivoted. He actually imposed some costs on China, small costs, but he was signaling to the Chinese that he can amp up the pressure. So I'm sure the Chinese right now are really concerned about Trump because, as you say,
is it good for us if they're caught off guard?
It's absolutely good for us because the Chinese have gotten too accustomed to thinking that they have controlled American presidents, which indeed they have. So this is a good thing that they are not sure about what Trump's going to do.
Gordon Chang, great to see you, Gordon. Thank you very much. Well, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio is in hot water for leaving his city to join G20 protesters in Germany. And stocks keep heading higher despite worries around the world. The one thing Congress is not doing that someone here says could reverse that, and soon. Amazing how our world and their world sometimes collide. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio just went to Hamburg, Germany for the G20 protest. Now, he skipped a police ceremony to be held here. Former New York police officer Bill Stanton joins us now. Let's be specific. This is what happened this week in New York. On Wednesday, New York Police Department officer Miosotis Familia, she's a mother of three. She was shot to death while just sitting in her patrol car. The next day, de Blasio jets off to Hamburg, Germany. Your thoughts?
Well, the optics on this are horrible. Now, I don't want to judge him overall, but what is he leaving? Tragedy, what you just said, trash, traffic, and transients. but he decides to go over to Germany to start trouble with Trump. You know, the metric here doesn't really make sense to me. I mean, prioritize New York City. Why are you running outside the country?
But I'm just thinking, the man who really saved New York, for those who don't know, back in the 70s and for the 80s and part of the 90s was a cesspool. We had a murder rate of over 2,000 a year. Now it's under 400. The man who turned that around was Rudy Giuliani by getting tough with the criminals. I can't imagine Giuliani, the day after a police officer is shot, as this officer was, leaving town.
No, absolutely not. And along with Bill Bratton and Jack Maple, the police commissioner in chief, they made this place feel safe. And it's like we're almost going back in time, as you mentioned, where on every street corner there were people, homeless people coming up to the windows, people sleeping in the streets. Traffic is insane. These are the priorities of New York City.
And look at where he's going, by the way. Look at specifically where he's going. New York City is the representation of capitalism down in Wall Street. You think of Tiffany's. It is kept alive by the free market system. These protesters are anti-capitalist. They represent exactly the opposite of what New York celebrates.
Well, David, I'm going to bring it back to family. You know, we were in families, there's people fight with each other, but never talk about family outside the family. That's right. We all know from The Godfather. So him going to Germany and trash talking our president of the United States.
Well, and trash talking capitalist system on which New York commerce is based.
Right. And it's how soon it's forgotten. You know, as we look at other countries like Venezuela, et cetera, where socialism is imploding their country. Do we really want that here?
And the extraordinary thing is this guy's going to win re-election, right?
My opinion, by a landslide.
Why?
More have-nots than haves. And when you castigate, when you make evil people that are successful, you call them evil rich. I call them inspirational successful. When you make that person bad, well, guess what? That's how you get more votes.
Bill Stanton. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you,
Great to see you. Appreciate it. Well, markets don't seem too worried about the protests over there or anything else for that matter. Stocks way up. But will all this change if there's new tax reform soon? Hadley Heath Manning of Independent Women's Forum joins us, along with Jonas Max Ferris, co-founder of MaxFunds.com, and Gary B. Smith, Cadena Group president. Gary, let me start with you. Markets still moving up. Jobs are still moving up. We got more jobs numbers, good job numbers on Friday. So what's to worry?
Well, I think the economy is more flatline than even the jobs report indicate. I think, the problem that, we discussed yesterday was the wages are not going up. Now, apart from that, what's to worry? I think that the worry is that nothing gets done in this administration. If we don't get the tax reform, if we don't get the health care reform, I think a lot of the basis of this rally, which was, the kind of the Trump rally, it goes away. All right. That's the concern.
But Hadley, what we also don't have is a president who's interfering with the markets every step of the way, as we did in the last administration. I mean, we have a president who is a businessman. We don't often get that. This guy is not good. The businesses don't have to worry that, oh my gosh, it's another day, we're going to get another regulation or another tax or another mandate.
Well, that's exactly right. I think there is some expectation built into our markets today that tax reform will ultimately come to fruition. But I don't think what we're seeing is single issue optimism. We know the Trump administration has already taken action to free our energy sector, to reform regulations and roll back unnecessary regulations on our economy. So this is a broad-based enthusiasm, an uptick in labor force participation. There's a lot of reasons to be hopeful.
And Jonas, again, the jobs number looked pretty good yesterday. I mean, it does appear that business people are planning for the future by hiring more workers. That's faith, no?